Hello again, everyone. This is Dr. Wiseman, and here we are beginning part 1B of the session 1 lecture on the digestive system. And in part 2, we'll get into more of the energy metabolism, but we're going to finish off digestive system in this lecture today. Moving further down the digestive tract from the esophagus, and then a little bit about peristalsis there for a moment, we cross the lower esophageal sphincter, which is a smooth muscle sphincter, into the stomach, which is a larger diameter, shall we say, pouch structure. It is a temporary holding location for food as it's emulsified, churned, and broken down prior to passing through the pyloric sphincter, which enters the first section of the small intestine called the duodenum or duodenum. Pyloric sphincters and esophageal sphincters and sphincters as a whole are there to prevent retrograde motion by and large. Now, obviously, we do eject contents from the stomach from time to time. We call that vomiting. And vomiting is as much a relaxation process of the esophageal sphincter as it is any type of muscular contraction. So, for vomiting to occur, you have to relax that sphincter. Same thing's true with pyloric sphincter. It's actually considered the most strong uh, muscle in terms of the sphincter muscle in order to prevent retrograde motion from the duodenum and the small intestine back into the stomach. If that's happening, that usually implies that there is a blockage of some kind, either a stricture, a twisting, a torus, if you will, of the small intestine, so material cannot physically move downstream, and so it starts backing up into the stomach. And that's a very, very, very serious life-threatening condition. So we're trying to prevent retrograde motion. There is a phenomenon, it's relatively rare, and hopefully no one ever gets to experience it. It's called projectile vomiting. Projectile vomiting is where you vomit so violently that you could literally hit a wall 10 feet or 12 feet away. All right, that's not just relaxation of the lower esophageal sphincter, which is what normal vomiting is. Now you've got this sphincter involved, and so it's like adding members to the team, if you will, and now you've had a truly projectile situation. Again, very rare, but implying some serious issues. The stomach anatomy is set up to allow for temporary storage of food boluses or boli, I guess, for further emulsification and detoxification, if you will. Um, the stomach is not particularly an absorptive surface. Yes, there are things that can be absorbed in the stomach. Alcohol is an example of this. Small lipophilic molecules, drugs can also be absorbed here. Anything that can move through a plasma membrane with relative ease will be absorbed by the stomach. Water. All right. So for testing purposes in the lab and so forth, you should know these squared structures: pylorus, pyloric sphincter, the rugae, the greater curvature is the outside here, lesser curvature in here. Fundus is this kind of extra pouch up here. This is one of the reasons why that they sometimes people will have certain recommendations in terms of body position and when they sleep or other things, because material can and does get sort of trapped up in here and it doesn't get propelled downstream. So get these terms down. Again, the stomach secretes acid, which other parts of the GI tract don't do. And again, there is some absorptive capability here, but not as much as further downstream. So those folds, unlike the surface area folds or the villi in the small intestine, we call these rugae. They're larger than the villi that we see in the intestines. It allows for distension and return. So you get this churning ability. That's the main thing, that we're talking about, sort of a mechanical digestion, mixing with the acid in order to kill off any potential pathogens if possible, begin denaturing proteins so they can be further broken down into amino acids. We also do secrete a particular enzyme. This is gastric pepsin. It is a protease. It is an enzyme that will break down protein. So protein digestion, we bolded the P here, begins with pepsin. That's the first one. It's an enzyme that actually works better in a lower pH. That's because the stomach is typically somewhere around between 1 and 2, which is very, very acidic. And so the enzyme has to be configured in such a way as to be functional in that acid environment. Once we have churned the food and mixed it with the acid, emulsified it, and begin digesting it, that's where instead of being a bolus, now it is called chyme. And that's what gives, and again, I'm not trying to make a vivid picture here, vomit, its characteristics, if you will. The microanatomy of the stomach includes two general structures, the gastric pit, which is really an exocrine tube, right? It's an exocrine tube, and the gastric gland, which are the cells that release material into this exocrine tube, which enters the stomach, aka also the GI tract. And we have four main types of cells. We have mucus cells, which are self-evident. Sometimes you hear the phrase goblet cell. There are a couple of different cell types that release mucin, including surface cells and so forth. So we're just going to call them mucus cells for now. Then you have these interesting cells that are on the side. We call those parietal cells. These are the ones that release hydrochloric acid. They actually pump protons and chloride into this exocrine tube for release into the stomach. The second thing that the parietal cells release is this protein called intrinsic factor. Intrinsic factor was named a long time ago before we really fully understood what proteins do and are. And intrinsic factor helps with absorption of vitamin B12 and by extension iron. So intrinsic factors are very, very important down the line when we start absorbing vitamin B12, which then becomes a cofactor for iron uptake. Then you have the chief cell, which secretes a precursor to pepsin called pepsinogen. A little bit of medical terminology here. If you see the ogen prefix, like we see right here that I'm flagging, the ogen put on a word usually means precursor to whatever that word is. Like, for instance, pepsinogen is the precursor to pepsin. What happens is it encounters the hydrochloric acid and then gets reshaped into an active pepsin. Trypsinogen, another digestive enzyme, is also the precursor to trypsin. So anytime you see ogen, you know precursor. So chief cells secrete that precursor to pepsin that then gets converted by the stomach pH. Then lastly, cell number 4 here is what we call an enteroendocrine cell. And this is actually a population of cells. In the stomach, it's releasing a hormone known as gastrin. The GI tract is actually an intensely endocrine coordinated system. Intensely. We do not give it enough credit for being the endocrine system that it is. We tend to think endocrine is more of the somatic endocrine, if you will, the shape our bodies take and our growth and our reproduction and that sort of a thing. But the real action in the endocrine situation is actually in the stomach. And so gastrin is involved in coordinating GI function as a hormone. And it's more than gastrin that's released. There are other things, and this is where I think there's a nice lesson here as well, and that's why I'm spending a little extra time on this slide. The human body, what makes the human body sometimes a challenge to treat, certainly pharmacologically, is that the body uses molecules in different ways. The same molecule can, like for instance, histamine, That's often involved in allergies and it's certainly involved in itch on your skin. So if you've got an itch on your skin, like you've got poison ivy or something, that's mediated by histamine. Serotonin, which is a very very common neurotransmitter, in fact, very important with mood function, is also a hormone that is used in the digestive tract. And that's why if you do pharmacological intervention of serotonin, common antidepressants, you often sometimes will get GI side effects for that. And then another hormone here is somatostatin, and statin means to slow down. So what we have here, this is actually for when the stomach is near the end of its period of holding material, that will begin to start slowing down, like for instance, acid secretion and so forth. Just a quick question for you, since we've been here for a little while. Pernicious anemia, if you might have heard that term, that is not a terribly uncommon term. Pernicious anemia is when the body cannot absorb iron properly, and it's usually because of vitamin B12 deficiency, or secondly, autoimmune attack against parietal cells. Remember how I talked about intrinsic factor? If you have an autoimmune attack that attacks these parietal cells, it can't secrete intrinsic factor. The cells can't secrete intrinsic factor. You can't absorb vitamin B12, which means you can't absorb iron. This is a great example of what we call sequelae, and the idea of thinking things through in a sequential manner. That is, you have a problem with the parietal cells, which means you have a problem with vitamin B12, which means you have a problem with iron. And I want to encourage you to begin thinking, especially when you're trying to solve problems and figure out what's wrong with a patient, to think sequentially. And here's just a photo showing the gastric pits and the gastric glands. You see a lot of mucus cells up here. As we get further and further down, you see the morphology shifts a little bit. Now you've got more of these parietal cells, chief cells, and then we have more secretory cells down here at the bottom. You can't see them straight away, but these big, bright white cellular types, those are the mucus cells. And we've discussed this previously, but just a quick reminder about what pH means. This is a nice little chart to remind you of what we're talking about with pH. And the more you understand pH, the stronger you will be. You get to know it. I know that chemistry doesn't always agree with us the way that we would like, but this is an important one. It's an important one for many, many different reasons, not just the stomach over here around pH of 1 and 2. That acid environment is going to disrupt some of the chemical bonds that comprise a large macromolecule. And most of the time, we're talking about proteins. But other molecules are stabled by chemical bonds that can be disrupted by a low pH. And that's why a low pH is toxic to many microbes. The human body is more geared toward the acid side of the pH scale than base. In fact, it's actually better from a clinical intervention standpoint that somebody is mildly acidotic than mildly alkalotic. Oh, by the way, this is a great little factoid. The most common cause of alkalosis in the human body is continuous or repetitive vomiting. When you vomit the stomach acid out, the body continues to try to replace that stomach acid, which means that it's pulling it out of the blood, and so your blood begins to get more alkalotic. Kind of an interesting little factoid there. So it's easier for the body to secrete acids than it is to secrete the hydroxyls that make alkaline. So we secrete acid, and that's what we use to kill the microbes. The problem, though, is that the acid can also disrupt the molecules in the stomach lining. So we have mucus and plenty of fluid in there, along with motion and so forth. Even food acts as a protection against the stomach acid. So when you bring food in, the stomach is secreting quite a bit of acid, and that motion and that propulsion, if you will, getting it out of there helps protect, in addition to the thick mucus around the surface of the stomach. A bit of a complex slide here. We're going to not try to drill down too much. The main thing is to be aware that there are three phases and what the names of those phases are. The initial phase is the, shall we say, a sort of a feed forward, if you will. Feed forward response in the body is a sort of reflexive response in anticipation of a stimulus arriving. So the cephalic phase is, Pavlov's dogs, if you will. It's a response that anticipates the arrival of food. So aroma, the taste in your mouth, the vision, if you will, whether it's in your mind's eye or in front of you. I get on Facebook, and Facebook knows enough that I love steak, and it just starts showing me some of the best steak in the world, and I start salivating and thinking about eating. So that's what we call the cephalic phase. It's really a feed forward phase. Then you have the actual gastric phase. This is when you have boluses or boli arrive, primarily protein, though it's not solely limited to that, lasts 3 or 4 hours, and that's about the time that the stomach is storing the material before it submits it into the intestinal tract. And so that's the third phase, the intestinal phase, and this is the very much the hormone part of it. And again, the idea here is that if as we're sending things into the intestine, there's less and less need for stomach acid. So the hormones from the intestine are actually feeding back into the stomach to tell the stomach to stop secreting acid. So we're creating chyme during the gastric phase. All right, we're sending out this hormone to say, get ready, pylorus, get ready, intestine. We're going to be sending you material, and then as the intestine receives that material, it sends hormones to feed back to shut down stomach secretory activity. As we've mentioned in previous slides in here, the digestive tract is an intensely endocrine system. And if you've noticed in advertising and in the news that there are now drugs out there, Wegovy is an example of this, and other drugs, those are all due to the fact that we now understand the endocrine system a little better than maybe 10 or 15 years ago, or 20 years ago. You might have been aware of them, but we didn't really understand what they did or how to manipulate it. And now that's changing. So I do want to spend just a little bit of time talking about just some key ones. Again, you don't have to know these things super duper detailed, but we do want to understand that there are things that will enhance appetite, that will lead, that if there are disorders therein, will lead to excessive consumption of food, which all of us are sort of intrinsically geared to do. If you think about the human condition over literally tens of thousands of years, the human body evolved typically in a caloric deficit. So obtaining more calories was good, and in many societies until extremely recently, I'm talking about in the last 100 or 200 years max, maybe 150 years max. That's extremely recent in terms of human evolution. That thinness and weight loss was somehow so socially desirable. Prior to that, it was actually weight gain. That elevated body mass was a symbol of status because you had access to food. You were well fed because you were good at whatever you do. So let's talk about some of the enhancers. And again, the key would be just to understand the generalities therein. Like neuropeptide Y enhances appetite, and that's coming from the hypothalamus. This funny one, this agouti related peptide. Agouti is actually a rodent, all right? And that's what's wild about this, is that we're finding things in other parts of nature that give us rise to understanding our own bodies. And agouti is involved in the coat color of rodents. And this protein is actually closely related to it in terms of its amino acid sequence. And it turns out it's an appetite enhancer. We have another set of hormones out there that are closely related to venom in Gila monsters, and that's just another story. Ghrelin is a big one. I've flagged that one in red. Ghrelin has been considered a major appetite enhancer. It's coming out of the hypothalamus. You can see all of these things are coming out of the hypothalamus. And then epinephrine, that's also known as adrenaline. We in the United States we call it epinephrine, and you should too. It actually activates the sympathetic nervous system, and leading to enhancement of appetite because gaining of calories. Then we have some suppressors. One comes from fat tissue. We didn't think fat was an endocrine organ until not too long ago, and one of the primary hormones coming out of fat is leptin. When there's an elevated levels of triglyceride in the blood, the fat will actually begin secreting leptin in order to suppress. And insulin, we think of as taking up sugar from the bloodstream for skeletal muscle in particular. Insulin has also been shown to be an endocrine appetite suppressor in the arcuate nucleus of the hypothalamus. Now we've reached the small intestine, and this is the major digestive and absorptive area. It's where we see the absorption of what we call macronutrients. Certainly, absorption can occur in the mouth and in the stomach and in the large intestine, particularly water in the large intestine, along with even the rectum. If you talk about suppositories, they're absorbed in the rectal area. Most of those are going to be micronutrients, but the vast majority of absorption, and especially of the macronutrients, that is amino acids, nucleic acids, ions, metals, if you will, like iron and zinc and calcium and those sorts of things, are all taken into the cells in the small intestine. So we have three regions. You have the upstream region called the duodenum, or some people say duodenum. It's a little longer or similar to the esophagus in length, larger diameter, and much more surface area. Most of your chemical digestion is occurring here. You're neutralizing the stomach acid, and now you're mixing with the enzymes that are coming out of the pancreas and the liver, leading to chemical digestion. And that's what's generally going on in the duodenum. There is some absorption going on, but most of the absorption is occurring in the jejunum. Now, we are getting some digestion here as well. I would be remiss to say that there isn't a lot of digestion going on here. It's the longest segment, so this is the longest amount of time that you're going to have going on through the small intestine. So there is a lot going on here as well. This is where the big time absorption is going on. And then lastly, we have the ileum, and the ileum is a little shorter than the jejunum, and it has a lot of what are called Peyer's patches. So these are basically modified lymphatic nodes, lymph nodes, that are involved in immune surveillance. It helps tell the immune system how to prepare for what is coming into the body in terms of mitigating potential pathology. We also see a fair amount of vitamin B12 absorption in here, back to that intrinsic factor, if you will. You have to bring in iron very, very carefully. Iron is a very reactive molecule. And so you use vitamin B12 and by extension intrinsic factor to bring that iron in, and that's where this is often going on. Small intestine, longest and also the largest surface area. The thing about biological diffusion is that there are aspects of biology that facilitate diffusion, and one of them is surface area. So if you had a square that was 10 feet wide, that square would have to be almost as long as a football field. Football field's 300 feet long, so you would have to be as long as a football field, 10 feet wide. That's a huge amount of surface area. All right, huge, 2,800 square feet. It's hard to wrap your brain around that until you actually get out and look at it. Here is a histological slide of the duodenum, and you can see now this structure known as a villus, plural villi. You're also beginning to see something sort of similar to the pits in the stomach, but now these are called crypts, and we'll talk about those in the next slide. But here you have the mucosal layer, then you have that thin muscle layer, that muscularis mucosae. Then you have the submucosa here, and we have a special mucus gland here called Brunner's glands, submucosa, and then you have the muscularis layer. That's primarily smooth muscle. That's the macro layer, and then finally you have the serosa here at the bottom. Here's the zoom in on these villi, these projections, if you will, into the lumens, as opposed to an invagination, like in the case of the pits in the stomach. We call these invaginations here, we call these crypts. That is like the burial crypts, if you will, underneath a church or something. This is where you see the endocrine cells, the enteroendocrine cells. The formal name of these crypts is the crypts of Lieberkühn. All right. The Panther cells are not necessarily hormones. They're actually a biochemical protection. They secrete an antimicrobial peptide that will either attack or break down microbial proteins and so forth, preventing infection. So it's an antimicrobial secretory cell. You certainly have enterocytes lining these crypts. And these enterocytes are involved in producing enzymes, and every enzyme you can think of, sucrase for sucrose, which is a double sugar maltase, another double sugar maltose, lactase, and then you have peptidase, you have lipase breaking down these molecules so that they can actually pass across a cell membrane barrier. They have to be small enough that they can get across the cell membrane. And so that's why you see an array of enzymes like that being secreted in starting with the duodenum, but mostly the duodenum is there for trying to limit the impact of the stomach acid coming into the intestine. But the real absorption is in the jejunum. Here is a histological comparison of the duodenum, the jejunum, and the ileum. And this is a good one. Here you can see that Peyer's patch. Again, it's for immune surveillance. This little comment here at the bottom, you said most chemical digestion has happened by the time you reach the jejunum. That's when we're talking about the stomach acid and emulsification process. So in the jejunum, you're seeing a lot of the enzymatic digestion occurring along with absorption. You do get some absorption in here. If something is already a small molecule, alcohol or simple sugars, small chain sugars, triglycerides in some cases, can be absorbed in the duodenum, but the majority, by virtue of its length and the total surface area, by the time you reach here, anything that hasn't been absorbed needs to be further digested and then absorbed in the jejunum and or the ileum. Again, the Peyer's patches here, vitamin B12 absorption, intrinsic factor, iron, and so forth are all in this ileum area prior to going into the large intestine. Okay, so this concludes part one. We will pick up with part two, which is more function and digestive roles of the GI tract, which will be for the session 2 lecture in week 1. Thanks for your time, and I will hopefully see you again soon.